Chapter 7. Judgment of Murder. Edmund, determined to stay on Mr. Dupin's good side so as to keep him looking for Sis, ran most of the way up Benefit Street to number 88. On the steps he went over his instructions, then, still breathless, he knocked on the door. A servant girl opened it. "Yes, please?" "Please, miss, I've a letter for a Mrs. Whitman." "Thank you," the girl said, and reached out. Edmund drew back. "I was told to give it only to her." "And who gave you that particular instruction?" the girl demanded. "Mr. Dupin." The girl examined Edmund suspiciously. "You're very dirty," she informed him. Edmund stammered. "I'm only doing what I've been asked, miss. If I let you in, will you promise not to touch anything and make no dirt?" "Yes, of course. Yes, miss, of course not." The girl led Edmund into the vestibule. "Stay here," she said, but before she hurried off, she gave him another warning. "Don't you be making a mess now." Grateful to be out of the cold, but upset at having been spoken to in such a way, Edmund looked beyond the hall where he'd been left. The walls were covered with patterned wallpaper. The floors had carpets. Silver and books were on display. It made him feel uncomfortable to be in a wealthy home. The servant girl returned. "Come, boy," she said tartly, and brought him into a well-furnished room. There, on a chaise lounge, a woman was reclining. Her face was fair, with soft brown eyes. Masses of ringlets reached her shoulders. The splendid silk dress she wore, and which was spread about her, the small book she held in one hand, made her look like a picture. Edmund had never seen anyone so grand. "Mrs. Whitman," the servant said, "this is the boy who's come." Mrs. Whitman gazed at Edmund with friendly curiosity. "I'm told," she said, "you have a letter for me?" Edmund, quite overwhelmed, merely nodded. "But you've been required to place it directly into my hands." "Yes, ma'am." "Is it about the afternoon tea Mrs. Powers, my mother, has arranged?" "I don't know, ma'am." Mrs. Whitman smiled. "May I have the letter, then?" she said. "Please, ma'am," Edmund managed. "I promise to give it only when you are alone. Who gave you these romantic orders?" "Mr. Dupin." "Who?" Mrs. Whitman asked. "Is Mr. Dupin?" Edmund didn't know how to reply. Mrs. Whitman repeated the name several times. Then suddenly her face became red. "Ah!" she cried. "Catherine, you may go." The girl gave Edmund what he took to be a frosty look, as if he'd done something wrong, then curtsied to her mistress and left. Mrs. Whitman smiled nervously. "So it is Mr. Dupin who has sent you?" "Yes, ma'am," Edmund said, increasingly uncomfortable about the confusion his coming seemed to have caused. He wished he could leave. "Where is Mr. Dupin?" "In Providence, ma'am." Mrs. Whitman sat up. "Is he?" "He had me deliver a letter to you last night." Her face paled. "Last night?" "It was very late." Mrs. Whitman suddenly stood. "Let me have your letter," she said with an air of alarm. Edmund gave it to her, wondering why she was so agitated. She started to open it, then stopped and hurried to the door. Edmund was sure she was checking to see if anyone was listening. Satisfied that no one was, she began to open the letter. But again she paused. "If anyone should ask you why you've come," she warned, "tell them it was Mr. Dupin who sent you." Further perplexed by this statement of the obvious, Edmund only nodded. Mrs. Whitman studied the letter for a long time. At last she looked up. "Can you tell me," she asked, "how Mr. Dupin is?" "He's fine." A line of worry creased her brow. "Where is he now?" "In a cafe on Wickenden Street." "Is he drinking?" Edmund looked down at his feet. "Please, it's very important. Was he drinking?" "A little." Mrs. Whitman sighed. "Mr. Dupin is a genius, the most passionate, the most romantic of men, but—" Suddenly she stopped. "What is your name?" "Edmund." "Edmund what?" Edmund Brimmer? Is that your real name? Yes, ma'am, Edmund replied, trying to grasp the meaning of these questions. Edmund, she began. A knock on the door interrupted. Mrs. Whitman turned to him. Not a word about this to anyone, she whispered urgently. Do you understand? No one. Edmund nodded. The door opened. It was the servant girl. Yes, Catherine? Mrs. Whitman asked. Ma'am, your mother wishes to speak to you immediately. After a moment, Mrs. Whitman said, Catherine, take this boy down to the kitchen and tell cook to get him bread and butter. Then ask my mother to join me here. She turned to Edmund. I will call for you. Edmund, feeling he had no choice, agreed. Besides, he was hungry. Dupin stood amidst a crowd before the courthouse, gazing at the entrance and waiting for the doors to open. Absent-mindedly, he rubbed his chin and realized he hadn't shaved. Nor did he feel particularly clean. That annoyed him. He knew he could not go to Mrs. Whitman's looking and feeling as he did. He would have to find a way to bathe. Dupin wondered anew what had possessed him to take an interest in the boy and his predicament. Was there really a story to be written? The image of the drowned woman came to his mind. She had been, he recalled, quite beautiful. Was it, he asked himself, her beauty which made her dead? Or was it death which made her so beautiful? The courthouse doors swung open. The crowd surged forward. Trembling, Dupin went inside. In Mrs. Whitman's kitchen, a large black oven bloomed with heat. Sitting before Edmund was a slab of bread slathered with jam. Cook had her hands deep in bread dough. All that gold, the woman chatted, and all those men digging it up in far-away California, then bringing it to Providence, where it disappears like so much green mist. Can you imagine, lad, what a body might do with such a pile as that? No pushing bread or delivering messages for you or me. Now there's a Providence I'd give my heart and soul to. You never know what will happen next, do you? Well, a prayer for the living, say I. Edmund ate his bread greedily. Sis is alive, he prayed under his breath. Sis is alive. Dupin gazed over the gloomy chamber that was the court. The air was close and fatigued, the walls streaked with soot, garlanded with dust-clogged webs. A few oil lamps oozed sickly yellow light over a silence stirred, just occasionally, by the flutter of legal papers. Spectators were slumped on benches, but it was too dark for Dupin to see their features. Were they there, he mused, just to avoid the cold? Would any of them pay attention to the proceedings? 2 court officers strolled in. A fat bailiff followed. Then came Throck, a bold dome of the head gleaming. He was followed by the bent, white-haired figure of Fortney, who looked about nervously as though fearful he was entering a trap. All rise, came a cry. People shuffled to their feet. The judge, black robes draped like a Roman toga about his thickest body, entered. Ponderously, he climbed up to his high seat, then hammered the gravel twice. State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations Court of Inquest in session, he intoned. Inquest in the matter of a known woman found dead in the bay, chanted a court officer. The gavel banged again. Proceed. Dupin tried to concentrate on the barely murmured words spoken by this officer, now that. They didn't seem to care if anyone beyond the judge heard, and the judge, with partly lidded eyes, seemed to sleep. Throck told how he was summoned by Fortney, how he had examined the dead woman, how he had called for the police wagon. Did he know who the woman was? No. Fortney gave his story, how he served as watchman on the ship, the Lady Liberty. How, when he relived of his watch, he had spied the body of the deceased as he rowed to shore. How he had hauled her in. Did he know who this woman was? No. The judge dismissed Throck and Fortney. They left. The talk continued, endlessly. Waves of tiredness swept over Dupin. Sorry he had come. He struggled to keep his eyes open. A doctor was called to testify and did so while constantly pinching his nostrils with a hairy hand that muffled his words. Dupin decided he didn't want to hear them. Instead, he tried to study the spectators. One, he noticed, was leaning forward, paying particular attention. Who was it? His eyes grew heavier. He heard the doctor say, "Marks on the throat, violence directed against the person unknown, by person or persons unknown, with malice aforethought." A groan seemed to come from one of the spectators. Who, Dupin asked himself, was making that pitiable sound? Someone cares. That's important. A clue. He strove to regain full consciousness, but could not. As he sank deeper into torpor and confusion, the vision of the drowned woman loomed up as if she herself was in the court observing her own inquest, crying for vengeance. Dupin pressed his hands to his eyes, seeking to dispel the vision. Cries of objections, cries demanding silence, a bang like the report of a pistol. A voice called out, "Judgment of willful murder of female unknown by persons unknown for reasons unknown." In the darkness, which was Dupin's thought, or was it a dream? He conjured the sounds of footfalls as if the phantom he just observed was fleeing the court, light hair trailing like a shroud. Then all became an abyss of dark. Behind Dupin, a hand slowly reached out, moved forward, and grasped his shoulder. A spasm of terror tore through him. Leaping to his feet, he whirled around. "No sleeping, sir," an aged court officer warned. Dupin looked about. The court was empty. Other than the officer, he was the only one there. He and a sense of inescapable death. Chapter 8. A Perfect Tomb. Edmund sat on his hands while Cook talked of little more than the bank robbery. He didn't care a thing about that. He preferred to think about Mrs. Whitman. He thought she was kind. Perhaps he could tell her what was happening. Even ask her advice about Mr. Dupin. They seemed to be friends. Before he could make up his mind, Cook finished her bread making and left the kitchen, telling him that Catherine would soon return. When more time passed, however, and Catherine didn't come, Edmund grew increasingly fretful that Mr. Dupin, waiting in the cafe, would be anxious about him. He decided he should tell Mrs. Whitman he must leave. Unsure which way to go, he made his way out of the kitchen and found a closed door. He was about to push it open when he heard urgent voices from the other side. "But when I intercepted that note last night," came a woman's whisper, "I felt obliged to send it to you. The man insists upon seeing her, and when you didn't reply, I'm so glad I noticed you next door in the cemetery." "Does she know he's coming?" a man's voice answered. "You may be certain I didn't give her the note." "But can you put him off?" the man asked. "We must try," the woman said. Despite her infatuation, Mr. Poe is totally unsuitable for her. If she is to marry again, you, Mr. Arnold, should be her husband. "I'm in perfect agreement," the man said. "I'm sure I can provide far better for her and you." "All the more reason to act quickly," the woman went on. "Everything must be done to get her to see the truth about him. He plans to call upon her this very afternoon. Naturally, I made it my business to invite other people. They mustn't be alone. You must be here, Mr. Arnold. I'm counting on you to expose him. Reveal him for what he is, an irresponsible drunkard with not a shred of decency." "Mrs. Powers, I will be only too happy," the man replied. "If he arrives unexpectedly, send Catherine to the hotel." Their voices drifted away. Edmund wondered who they were and what they were talking about. Expose whom? Chiding himself that it was, after all, the business of adults and not his, he cautiously pushed open the door. Now he found himself in a little foyer. A scrap of paper lay upon the floor. Not wanting the servant to think he had left it there, he picked up the scrap. And when he did, he saw that it had odd writing on it. 988, 98, 5, 48, etc. Even as Edmund tried to make sense of what he read, Catherine burst upon him. "There you are," she said. "I've been looking all about for you. Quickly now, Madame is waiting." Edmund hastily shoved the paper into his pocket and followed. Dupin stood outside the courthouse, taking in great gulps of cold air, his thoughts reverberating with what he had heard. Edmund was right. His aunt had been murdered. That thought quickly fused with the fantastical image he'd concocted in the courtroom, the vision of the murdered woman haunting the inquest. Dupin tried to shake his head clear. The murder was the last thing he needed to think about. If he was to marry Mrs. Whitman, he must remain fixed to the purpose, clear-headed, sober. It was drink that deflected him, confused him, he told himself. He put his hand to his heart and swore that he would not drink again. Ever. So resolved, Dupin decided it would do him good to walk briskly back to the cafe where the boy would be waiting. As Dupin crossed to the east side of the Providence River, he couldn't help but observe the row of fine buildings directly across the way, snug beneath the bluff of College Hill. One building in particular caught his eye, a brick structure with an unusually graceful gable roof. Drawing closer, he realized it was the Providence Bank, the same bank in which last night's robbery had taken place, and on that same night, he noted that the murder had occurred. Wasn't it Throck who had mentioned all of that? Dupin snorted. Criminals often drew attention to their own criminal acts. His interest piqued, Dupin studied the building. It was a structure 3.5 floors high, whose central door, there were no others, was large and flanked by 2 pillars. To either side were small windows covered with bars. The floors above had 5 windows each, also barred. Dupin remembered the cafe waiter saying something about the gold having disappeared like magic. Other people seemed to be curious too. Loiterers were hanging about the bank's entrance, a sufficient number to require posting a guard from the regular Providence police. When Dupin approached, the man held up a hand. "Sorry, sir, you must have particular business to enter today." "My name," Dupin announced grandly, "is Auguste Dupin, of the Lowell Insurance Company. I have a particular concern in the matters at hand." The policeman saluted. "Very good, sir," he said, stepping back. "You may pass." Dupin, watched with curiosity by the loiterers, entered the bank. When Edmund returned to the drawing-room, Mrs. Whitman was alone and standing by a window. From the nervous way she pressed her hands together, he could see she was even more agitated than before. "Here's the boy, ma'am," Catherine announced. "Very good," Mrs. Whitman replied without turning. "You may go." "Yes, ma'am." As she left, Catherine gave Edmund yet another hostile glance. Again, he wondered what he had done to deserve it. For a moment, Mrs. Whitman remained where she was, staring out the window. Edmund studied her, waiting for the right moment to talk to her about his plight. But the longer she kept her back turned, the greater grew his uncertainty. She appeared so very upset, it seemed hardly right for him to intrude upon her thoughts. At last she faced him. "Edmund," she began, "I wish to ask you something about Mr. Dupin." Edmund's heart sank. She seemed so preoccupied with Mr. Dupin. How could his concern about Sis interest her? "You said that he had been drinking," Mrs. Whitman continued. "A great deal?" Edmund was not sure how to answer. "Edmund," she pressed, "I need to know the truth, no matter how unpleasant. There is a possibility, a likelihood, that your friend, Mr. Dupin, and I may be—" She paused and shook her head. "I have the greatest admiration for the man and his work. Perhaps you're not aware that I write poetry. It was I who reached out Again she broke off. Edmund, would you trust a person who drinks? It was a question Edmund had asked himself about Mr. Dupin. As for answering, he didn't know what to say. Here was an adult seeking advice from him. He was too startled to speak. Mrs. Whitman, however, took his silence as an affirmation of her concern. She sighed. Yes, even a little is too much. You call him Mr. Dupin. May I ask why? The question surprised Edmund. Perhaps Mrs. Whitman and Dupin were not friends after all. Then he recollected that when he first came, she seemed to have forgotten the man's name. It's his name, ma'am. You know him by no other? Should I? Edmund asked, finding the woman as baffling as Mr. Dupin. Mrs. Whitman bit her lip. Edmund, how do you come to know him? Are you some relation? We met last night. How? Without answering, Edmund looked into Mrs. Whitman's troubled face. To answer that question would be to explain his emergency, and he'd already decided he could not do that. She sighed again. Very well. I wish you to give him a message. Yes, ma'am. Tell Mr. Dupin he may come. Not at 4 o'clock as he proposes, but at 3:30. And Edmund, tell him not to come to the front door. No. He should go behind the house to the small graveyard whose entrance is on Church Street. We can meet in privacy. No one ever goes there. Now repeat what I said. 3:30 behind the house, in the cemetery on Church Street, where no one ever goes. Good, she said. You may leave. Edmund started for the door, but she called him back. You need not repeat what I asked you about him. And, she added, lowering her voice, be advised the maid Catherine works for my mother. Mrs. Powers, not me. Now hurry and deliver my message. Edmund left her. Dupin walked into the room nearest the bank entrance. 6 clerks, all perched on high stools before high desks, were scribbling away on ledger books by the light of gas lamps. At the back of the room nearest the coal fire was an older gentleman whose desk, rather like a pulpit, stood higher than the others. When Dupin entered, everyone in the room looked up. I am, Dupin said, responding to their inquiring looks, a private investigator from the Lowell Insurance Company. I've been sent here to examine the place from which the gold was taken. All heads turned to the rear of the room where the older man was perched. Mr. Peterson, this man called out, show this gentleman the vault. Yes, Mr. Poley, said the young man closest to the door. He had sprung off his stool when Dupin announced himself. Dupin turned. Mr. Peterson looked to him to be no more than 16 or 17, the youngest in the room. His eyes were a pert, bright blue. His cheeks were round and red, his hair so blond as to be almost white. This way, sir, Peterson called. He'd taken up a candle and gestured to the hall. Dupin followed. From there, the young man led the way up a central stairwell which corkscrewed to the top floor. Terrible shocking, isn't it? The young man said as they climbed. All that gold's gone. When did it arrive? A week ago. Not a secret, I gather? Oh, no, sir. Very much a secret, Peterson replied. Though not here in the bank. We all knew it was coming. Mr. Poley, he's that older gentleman in charge of the accounting room. He gave orders that not a word should be spoken of it. Even as he told you? The young man giggled. Mr. Poley is a regular chatterer, sir. As open as his ledger. No, he's not one to keep a secret. There was great excitement about the gold being from California. They say it's there for picking off the ground. Do you believe that? Some say yes, some say no. Here we are, sir. They had gone up 3 flights, and now were on the top floor. Dupin, panting from the effort, stood before a massive black iron door. It was open wide. Did you see this gold arrive? Dupin asked, eyeing the door as if it were an adversary. Not me, sir. Mr. Poley told us it came in from the middle of the night, in bar form, direct from the ship that brought it here. He said it took 5 men to carry that chest up those same steps we came on. Did the gold happen to come from a ship called the Lady Liberty? Dupin asked. I can't say that I know. The gold was placed here, said Peterson, nodding to the vaults. You're welcome to look in. But I can assure you there was not a thing to be found. They had me clean it out this morning myself. Not a thing? Well, not quite, said Peterson after a momentary hesitation. I did find this. He reached into his pocket and held out his hand. A white button lay on it. Perhaps, he said with a smile, you can solve the mystery. Dupin reached into his pocket, felt the button Edmund had found, and was about to draw it out when Peterson said, Go into the vault, sir. Rest assured, I won't lock you in. The mere idea gave Dupin a turn of nausea. He glanced up into Peterson's smiling blue eyes, then gazed into the vault with discomfort. Tentatively, he took the candle Peterson offered and forced himself to enter. It was as large as a small room, cold, dark, and empty, and Dupin was struck instantly by how, once inside, he felt completely cut off from the world. He might have been 100 feet underground rather than, as he knew to be the case, 100 feet above and snug against the hill. He lifted his eyes. The dancing light of the candle flame created the illusion that the walls were moving in and out, as if he were a captive within a beating heart. His queasiness increased. More and more unsteady, he put a hand to one of the walls. It was hard, clammy. He cringed back and kept to the middle of the room. Is there no way in or out save this door? He asked. His voice produced an answering metallic echo. His breathing became labored. Just this, Peterson said brightly, rapping the iron door of the vault. But they say it wasn't even opened. Tight as a coffin lid, and still, for all that, the gold was taken. And the box in which the gold was kept? Dupin asked. He was growing weaker. Perhaps I misspoke, Peterson replied. There was no box. I was told the gold bars were unloaded outside and carried in, one by one, and placed where you stand. Quite manageable that way. Dupin, fighting off growing dizziness, looked down. What's the floor made of? He asked. Iron. Fearful of total collapse, Dupin knelt to touch the floor's cold surface. When he did, he noticed a bit of string. He snatched it up and put it in his pocket, then came unsteadily to his feet. Hands trembling, he held the candle high. Directly overhead, he saw what looked like a shaft. It had an opening no more than a foot wide and receded up into darkness. And that? An air shaft. To the roof? Peterson stepped forward to peer up. I should think so. Couldn't the thief have come down through there? Dupin managed to say, despite the tightness of his throat. I doubt it, Peterson answered, taking another look. It's far too narrow, isn't it? I'm fairly thin myself, but I couldn't get through. Yes, Dupin agreed, laboring for breath. No person could. The story, Peterson said, is that the man who built this vault had a desperate fear of being locked in. That's why he built the shaft. Otherwise, a trapped person who might not be rescued for days would perish from suffocation. It would make a perfect tomb, now wouldn't it? It was then that Dupin fainted. Chapter 9. News of Sis. As Edmund hurried toward Fox Point, he kept thinking about Mrs. Whitman. Why had she asked him so many questions about Mr. Dupin? Edmund found it all very upsetting, the more so when he realized he had a few satisfactory answers himself. He made up his mind that when he reached the cafe, he would ask Mr. Dupin for some. Dupin was not at the cafe, however. Merely puzzled at first, Edmund asked the waiter who had served them if he knew where Mr. Dupin had gone. Oh, him, the waiter said when Edmund offered a description. He went off right after you did. Right after? He did leave a notebook. You sit down. I'll fetch it. Edmund, his anxiousness increasing, sat at one of the tables. In moments, the waiter placed the notebook before him. Edmund gazed at it, wondering what it was that Mr. Dupin had been writing. No, it would be wrong to look. But then, they were his answers that Mr. Dupin had put down. He would just take a glance. Edmund drew the book close and opened it cautiously. On some pages were just words like search and death. Death, he quickly saw, appeared more than any other. And then there were notes which were so rambling and confused Edmund could make no sense of them. But on one page he was able to grasp something. It was headed, Plot. Story of search. Boy searching for vanished sister. Wants her to be alive. Of course, no tension there. To be effective must be a puzzle. Is she alive? Enter Dupin. Who took her? Much confusion. But then? Boy finds that. One can find life only through death. I know. My sis is dead too. Edmund stared at this page, horrified. He recalled Mr. Dupin's questions and his own answers. These lines were much more than that. He reread them. When he reached the word death, the word so often written, he shuddered, closed the book, and pushed it away. There was something very wrong with Mr. Dupin. But, he asked himself, who else could he turn to? He'd already decided against Mrs. Whitman. He considered that night watchman. Mr. Throck, he thought his name was. He'd seen him at the saloon the night before. Perhaps he could find him there again. Then he recalled Mr. Dupin's words that only he, Dupin, would be able to find his sister. The next moment, Edmund reminded himself that in some magical way, Mr. Dupin had figured out that Sis had been stolen. He had even reminded him that on the way back from the saloon, he'd met a white-haired man on the street. Perhaps he would find Sis. Trust adults, his poor aunties always told him. Trust adults. Edmund sighed. Sometimes it was very hard. Too hard. Dupin was drowning, sinking beneath the bay. Cold water seemed to be pouring into him, gagging him, suffocating him. He wanted air desperately, but he was being held by the throat, pushed deeper down. It took superhuman effort to open his eyes, to see who was trying to kill him. It was a man with white hair. It was Peterson, the young accountant, bending over him. Sir, are you all right? Gradually, Dupin's head cleared. The throbbing eased. With Peterson's help, Dupin sat up and looked about, unsure of where he was. Then he remembered. He was inside the bank vault. Feeling acute embarrassed, he held out a hand. Peterson took it and helped him to his feet. Some fresh air might do you good, sir, the young man suggested. He guided Dupin to the steps. Hold on to the balustrade. Slowly now. And to the lowest level, Peterson paused. Just a moment, he cautioned, and dashed into the office and to Mr. Polly's desk. Ah, Mr. Peterson, did you show the inspector the vault? Yes, sir, Peterson whispered, but I'm afraid he suddenly took ill. Mr. Polly became alarmed. Ill? He said loudly. The other cloaks turned and listened. Perhaps, Peterson said, it would be wise for me to make sure he reaches his lodging safely. Good thought, Mr. Peterson. See that you do. I should be much obliged. Peterson started off. Ah, Mr. Peterson, Mr. Polly cried. The clerk turned. Your friend, Mr. Ratchet, came in and left a message for you. He handed Peterson a folded piece of paper. Hesitating momentarily, Peterson took the note. Go on, sir, Mr. Polly urged. You'd best take the time to read it. He said it was urgent. Under Polly's frankly curious eyes, Peterson unfolded the note and read it quickly. When he glanced up, he realized everyone was watching him. Is something the matter? Polly asked. You look stricken. Peterson jerked around. No, sir, he said. Not at all. I'll see to the inspector. Stuffing the note into his pocket, he returned to the hall, relieved to find Dupin still there. The two emerged onto the street. Dupin, aware that they were being observed closely from the crowd of loiterers, turned from them and took into the fresh air. "Can I help you anywhere?" Peterson inquired. "I have permission to see you to your lodgings." Dupin shook his head. "I can make my own way," he insisted. "To tell the truth, sir," Peterson confided, loath to let Dupin go, "I don't intend to be an accountant forever. I've always wanted to be an investigator like you. I believe I have a good mind for it. I've read a great deal, too. Eugene Sue and Vidocq, our own Edgar Allan Poe. Have you ever read The Gold Bug? It's very instructive, I think. I'm afraid," he rattled on. "I didn't catch your name when you introduced yourself. Would you be kind enough to give it to me?" Dupin gazed at him, then said, "Edward Grey." "Very good, Mr. Grey," Peterson replied, producing a calling card. "Here's mine." Dupin glanced at the card. "Mr. Randolph Peterson, Hotel American House," and shoved it into a pocket. "If you ever need someone here in Providence to assist you in your investigations, Mr. Grey," Peterson pressed, "please call upon me. I'm thoroughly discreet." He held out his hand. Dupin shook it lamely. "Thank you," he said. Peterson watched anxiously as Dupin walked away. Then he unfolded the note he had been given by Mr. Poley, and studied it. "At the hotel," he murmured, only to stop when he realized he was talking out loud. Then he hastened up the hill behind the bank. Two of the loiterers separated from the crowd. One followed Peterson. The second, Mr. Throck, followed Dupin, and watched him go into the first saloon he came upon. Edmund continued to wait in the Wickenden Street Cafe, growing more and more troubled the longer Mr. Dupin was away. Then it occurred to him that perhaps he was the one who was misunderstood. Perhaps Dupin had gone to the room and was waiting there. He quickly snatched up the notebook and raced to his building and up the steps. From the hallway, he saw that his door was open. He stopped short. His hopes soared. Sis had returned! Down the hall he dashed. The room was a shambles. Everything was scattered. The table was overturned, the chair tossed aside. The trunk had been opened, and its contents were spewed about the floor. Stunned, fighting back tears of anger and despair, Edmund began to set the furniture to rights, then the litter. He turned to Mr. Dupin's belongings, including a shocking number of empty bottles, and put them back into the carpet bag. Finally, he collected all that had been pulled from his aunt's trunk. It was only then that Edmund realized something had been taken. Auntie Prue had had a drawing, a portrait of herself, and Mum made by a street artist near Pidackley Circus just before his mother had gone to America. Auntie claimed it was a good likeness of them both, and had got the picture up in a little frame. She liked to show it to Sis and Edmund, saying that seeing it helped to keep up one's faith. The drawing, and that alone, had been taken. To Edmund, it seemed a senseless theft. Once the room was set to rights, he flung himself on the bed and looked about. Now that he was alone, now that he had to confront the fact that he might never see his sister or his auntie there again, Edmund realized how empty, how ugly it was. The very cracks on the ceiling and walls, as if they were some contorted message, seemed to spell out the undoing of his life. The thought of a message reminded him of the paper he had discovered in Mrs. Whitman's house. He took it from his pocket and once more tried to decipher it. Unable to, he stuck the paper in his sister's book. His sister's book, unreadable messages, ugly, deserted room. A fist of anger hammered in his chest. "No!" Edmund shouted. "Sis is not dead. She is alive. She is!" Consumed by sudden hopelessness, Edmund flung the book across the room, then hid his face in the blanket. The next moment he was up. He had to find Mr. Dupin. His drinking done, Dupin proceeded unsteadily toward Wickenden Street. When he reached it, he remembered he had wanted to buy Edmund a coat. He entered the first clothing shop he saw. A salesman approached. "May I help you, sir?" "A coat," Dupin said. "Don't move," the salesman exclaimed. In moments he returned, holding one. "Beautiful coat, isn't it?" Dupin looked at it dubiously. "There's a story behind this coat," the salesman said. "A man orders a coat, not cheap, mind you. He has it fitted and cut for him. He comes in, this morning actually, for the final fitting. We are trying it on when suddenly, with not so much as by your leave, the gentleman rushes off, and we have not heard from him since." The oddness of the event piqued Dupin's curiosity. No idea what made him go. The salesman shrugged. A boy had wandered in. A boy? A begging boy. "I'll tell you what, sir. That man never put a penny down. Of course, we took him for a gentleman. Now we've done the work and don't know whether he'll be back or not. Quite a loss for us." "That begging boy?" Dupin asked. "What time did he appear?" The man considered. "Between 9:30 and 10. Now, sir," he persisted, "since we don't know if our customer is coming back, we would be willing to sell you this coat, taking it in a bit, at a considerable saving. That way we wouldn't lose, nor would you." "What did you say this man's name was?" "I didn't, sir, but I don't mind saying." "It's his embarrassment, not ours." "Mr. Ratchet was the name he gave. Mr. Ratchet, perhaps you know him?" Dupin shook his head. "We would be happy to let you try the coat on," the salesman suggested. "I don't think I'm interested," Dupin said. "Though I am getting married and shall want a better coat soon. May I offer my congratulations, sir?" the salesman intoned with a bow. Edmund kept running between his room and the cafe. One moment he was sure Mr. Dupin had deserted him, the next that Mr. Dupin was late only because he discovered word of Sis and had gone to fetch her. Then, not knowing what to think, he spent the time inventing new calamities. Another hour passed before Edmund saw Dupin. He was coming down Wickenden Street, not in a hurry, merely strolling, gazing now this way, now that. Edmund, close to tears, rushed up to him. Dupin stopped, studied the boy, frowned and said, "What is the matter now?" Edmund stared at him in disbelief. You said you'd wait for me at the cafe. Did you think I have nothing better to do with my time than to sit in such places?" "But, Edmund," Dupin announced, "I could use a drink." He started for the cafe. Edmund stood his ground. Dupin looked back over his shoulder. "I have received news of your sister," he said and continued on. Edmund's resolution dropped away. He raced to catch up.